Next question.
Yeah. So I had this. I think you posted somewhere that I think quote by Krishnamurti that authority is binding and blinding,
Yes.
and this is something that I relate to a lot because I kind of have like no authority over my life. I just follow what others are saying, and this is something that I learned during my childhood because my dad would
Yes.
just do these things, and if I would go against him, then I would assume that I would get abandoned as such, the feeling of abandonment or something along those lines. So I
Abandonment, you
would just,
said? Abandonment if you didn't do what he said? Okay, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, kind of
Hmm.
feeling along those lines. So I basically started following authority, and eventually I realized it's pretty easy to do so. Like, because you don't have to think, but the problem with that is you lose your own spirit, and like, I feel like I will lose out on my own individuality, and eventually I will realize that I didn't do anything for my own sake. So what can I do to get out of this mentality? I know it requires effort to get out of this in the first place.
Okay, so what Krishnamurti or I said, authority is binding and blinding. Is that
Yes.
Krishnamurti? Krishnamurti said that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think,
Well, now Krishnamurti is an interesting guy, right? He didn't really have a father, and he wasn't raised by his mother, and he didn't even grow up in his own country. He was raised in Britain by some upper class theosophists. So he has a very peculiar outlook on life. And uh, he's wonderful inspirationally, but he's very difficult in terms of concrete teaching. All right. Uh, he'll say things like, the observer is the observed, and leave it at that, right? And everybody kind of goes, well, I don't know, what does that mean? You know, whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? So he's not the first person I would go to if I was uh, trying to learn before awakening. So now, the question is about authority. Authority versus what?
uh, one's own authority, like authority of someone else over self versus one's own authority.
There's another. You said something in there about not answering to your own spirit or something like that.
Kind of,
I
yes.
kind of push back on that. I want you to look at that more closely. I was raised by the Marines, right, when I was a teenager, late teenage, right? And the Marine Corps really doesn't care what you think. This was like a preparatory school for delinquents, really, and it was during the Vietnam War, and or a reform school is probably the more accurate way to put it. But at any rate, they were real Marines. They go back and forth from Vietnam and my school, and they would beat the crap out of us basically. Now, I never felt more independent internally, and so I think you're assuming that because you're under the boot of the boot, because you're under the authority of your father in whose house you're living, right? That your spirit is somehow not free. Examine that more carefully. And this is some of the greatest books ever written were written in prison. Sri Aurobindo's. What's the name of it? Yeah, The Life Divine was written in prison. Malcolm X wrote his best work in prison. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, much of it in prison, or some of it in prison. And so I'm going to ask you to go back and really look at that, because that sounds like someone who hasn't looked at it himself directly. And in this work, that's all that matters is uh, what can you know for yourself. And that's what it means about the authority. Now, although the Marines are great soldiers, I wasn't going to be a soldier. I knew that, but they taught me a lot of things, and for that I'm grateful. And I also kind of admire them as soldiers. but that doesn't mean that my inner spirit, much less, obeys that. And if they manage to capture my body, like happens with slavery or with imprisonment or with, in feudal times or whatever, that has, in my experience, maybe it's different for you, so get back to me, that has nothing to do with freedom of spirit. On the contrary, sometimes it's the most oppressive circumstances that call the spirit into action, freedom. Follow-up question on that?
Not necessarily. Like I had some question quite somewhat related to it, but
Okay.
like
Let's pause for a moment.